Hello, my name is Andrew Kirkpatrick, and today we're going to talk about how you can centralize legacy auth at the Ingress gateway. So, software applications used to have fairly simple concepts of authentication and authorization. The user logs in, and then is typically assigned a role from a handful that are available, such as, say, administrator, moderator, editor, and so forth. But as applications grow into larger monoliths or distributed systems based on service oriented architecture, that typically results in more complex requirements for more granular roles and more specific permissions to, say, different groups of users or for specific resources. So eventually, you end up with authentication and authorization logic and data all over the place. So, one possible solution to this is to migrate some or all of your authentication and authorization logic and data into some kind of centralized service. And we'll be covering how you can integrate that centralized service into an ingress or API gateway or proxy. So, some of the things we're going to talk about today. So, why wouldn't you just use an off the shelf product? How can you identify and categorize the different authentication types that are in use? What identity and authorization information would you and should you send downstream to your services? Where in this flow would you handle authorization? And how can you actually set up a standalone auth service next to your gateway? So, why wouldn't you just use something off the shelf? In a lot of cases, some of the products that you might bring in either assume that you're working on a greenfield or a brand new project, so no pre existing users or authentication types, meaning you can simply bolt it on in front and then you use their data store to store and manage your users. However, in most cases, you're probably going to have an existing or possibly legacy project, in which case you've got to consider how easy is it going to be able to add this product into your existing tech stack, whether that be integrated into your code base, bolted onto your existing infrastructure. How would you actually go about introducing an authentication type to your users, your customers? On that basis, how would you deprecate some of the existing authentication types that you're currently using in order to eventually move towards this new authentication type? And the identity and authorization data that you're storing, how backwards compatible is it with some of the newer concepts in this authentication type you're introducing? For example, JWT grants. Additionally, and very importantly, how would you actually migrate or synchronize the identity data that you currently have with this new product? So if you're going to copy and synchronize it across, how easy is it actually to add into the new system? And also, how easy is it to extract it from your current system? If you're going to copy it across, can you just do it all in one go? Or if you're going to try and keep it in some kind of active synchronization, how real time is that synchronization going to be? How often does your user access and their permissions change in order to keep that synchronization up to date? And how dangerous actually is it if it gets out of sync? From a security perspective, people getting accidentally logged out, having the incorrect permissions at the wrong time. So how would you identify and categorize what kind of authentication types are in use? So there's many different authentication types, right? Here are just some of the common ones, like based on the HTTP authorization header, authentication you might have in cookies, various API keys, and so forth. So is there some kind of way that you can actually work out, if you're using multiple of these, which authentication type is in use, say, based on what path is being accessed, domain or subdomain information, or any information contained within some of the HTTP headers that are being sent? For each authentication type, does it always actually represent the same kind of identity? For example, is it always a user, or is it some kind of other concept in your domain? And how is auth actually configured? For example, if it's within a framework, is it configured in code, configuration files? Is it database lookups? Could be from a variety of sources. On top of that, you could have multiple different authentication types within the same code base, say within a larger monolith, or you could possibly have different authentication types in different services. On top of that, you could have the same authentication type used across your entire platform, but actually implemented in different technology stacks and different languages. So how would you go about figuring out a programmatic way to combine these? So one way is to try and do it in some kind of logical fashion. So can you actually associate different types of authentication based on, for example, if you're trying to go to an admin endpoint, is that based on the domain or subdomain you're using? Or if, say, someone's trying to visit an older version of your API, does that start with a different prefix, use different content negotiation, some way that you can kind of eliminate some of the types that are used for different types of requests. Alternatively, if that's not possible, one way you could do it is have it in some kind of logical order and try all of them every single time. So say, here are all of the types that I expect to see. Let me try and figure out if it's any one of these ones that I expect to see, and if not, then we assume that they can't authenticate. So if you're handling authentication at ingress, what kind of information would you be able to load up to send to these downstream services? So you're handling these different authentication types. What does the actual underlying data look like? Say, if you're trying to authenticate a user, what does a user look like in your current data store? Can you represent the different data that you're loading for these different authentication types into some kind of similar structure? Say, if all of them represent users, is it relatively easy to represent these users in, say, a JSON object? So most ingress gateways can add headers that have returned from the auth service, and they will attach that to the response that is forwarded to the downstream service. And for example, you could return this JSON object to the ingress gateway from the auth service, and then it gets encoded in a header that then gets passed down. So an example of how that might look like, so we say take HTTP basic authentication. So we have a username and password. The gateway forwards that request to the auth service, which then looks it up in, say, a SQL database. The auth service then builds a JSON object out of that, representing our user in this case. It gets encoded into a header and then attached to the request that is then forwarded to whichever downstream service can then use it to additionally identify the user if they so require. Something to consider, though, especially if you're dealing with larger, more complex legacy systems, is that each authentication type might not necessarily represent the same thing or have the same concepts. Say, for example, you might have some older API operations act on behalf of an entire company, irrespective of user. In some cases, you might have users that look completely different, like some might not have certain properties missing or might have different concepts represented differently. So just try and consider, how can you represent all of these in some kind of common format that all of your different downstream services will be able to understand. For example, say with some kind of common library. So where in this flow would you actually handle authorization? So in a lot of cases, it makes sense to centralize, say, the authentication data in this place, but not necessarily move all of the authorization logic into this central service. So a typical auth response is typically true or false, like I'm either going to allow or deny someone to proceed. So in that case, think of authentication as purely just the identity. Who are they? And then authorization as, based on who are they, what am I going to allow them to do? Are they allowed to access or modify or delete this particular resource? And the most basic kind of representation of that is the user logged in or not? So say if a user is trying to update their password, fundamentally, the most basic authorization is you can only do that if you have any identity at all, regardless of roles or permissions. So in terms of how that would work on a very broad scope is, say, if you had someone trying to access administration endpoints, if you know they're trying to go to an admin endpoint, you can simply check if they have, say, a top-level role admin, and then go, okay, I'm not going to actually even forward these requests down to any of the admin endpoints or an admin service because I know that this user doesn't have the particular role required for that. So I'm going to reject and deny this request essentially at the ingress gateway via the auth service. However, as a more complex kind of example, eventually you might get more granular roles, for example, roles for specific resources. And then on top of that, you might end up with permissions for, say, specific resources for specific users, such as an access control list. So say in this example, it might not make sense to move the authorization logic for what an individual user can do to specific documents out of the document service, but it probably makes sense to move the roles and access control list data into the central auth service. So you then have one place where it's loaded, which you can then optimize with, say, caching strategies, and then essentially attach that to the request and forward that for the document service to then decide. So the data is centralized, but you can still retain some of that authorization logic in a decentralized nature. So it can continue to check roles and ACLs as it would previously, if that assists in kind of simplifying some of the migration while trying to take advantage of some of the centralization. So how would you actually set up a standalone auth service next to your gateway? So most ingress gateways or proxies today that are in common use will usually allow you to specify some kind of external auth service that communicates via HTTP or gRPC. Here are some of the more common examples you might see that offer, say, a middleware or plugin that's able to accommodate this. Obviously, there are many more products on the market, but here are just some common examples. An example of how this flow might work. So a request comes into the gateway, is typically forwarded onto the external auth service, usually without the body. So the auth service determines whether it should deny or allow the request based on information in, say, the headers, path, or other request information. Typically, this will then say allow the request through, and header modification will either remove and strip some of the headers, or more commonly, it will add some headers, for example, containing identity or authorization logic, as covered in the previous example. An example of how this might work in, say, something like emissary ingress, you set up a Kubernetes custom resource definition that basically specifies, I would like to use an external auth service at this location. And then you set basic configuration options such as what is the timeout, what HTTP status do I want you to return based on auth denied, and what kind of headers to handle. So to summarize everything we've talked about, you can use almost any kind of authentication that you're already using within your system. That just kind of depends on the complexity of porting it over and what software development resources you have available. To try and kind of reduce the amount of checks or lookups you're making to speed up auth and reduce the load on, say, data stores such as the database, try and determine what kind of authentication types you're using for different paths, domain, or header combinations. You can then pass the identity or authorization information that you've loaded up onto your downstream services. And it's worth considering how you can kind of best represent that information in a kind of common and consistent manner. You can then handle none, some, or all of your authorization in this central auth service, depending on what suits your use case and what makes sense from a kind of practical standpoint. And then something to also briefly touch on is if you're going to move towards using a central auth service, worth considering what your service level objectives and indicators are around reliability and uptime for this service to ensure that it's highly available, because that will now stand in the critical path of requests to different parts of your platform. A brief bit of information about me. I work for StackAdapt, which is a programmatic advertising platform. We're always hiring, so if you're interested in tackling engineering challenges at scale, please feel free to visit our careers page. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully this gives you some ideas as to how you might be able to centralize legacy auth in some of your projects. The slides should be available online, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference.